Welcome to Let's Hear It.
Let's Hear It is a podcast for and about the field of foundation and nonprofit communications, produced by its two co-hosts, Eric Brown and Kirk Brown. No relation.
Well said, Eric. And I'm Kirk.
And I'm Eric. The podcast is sponsored by the College Futures Foundation. We're talking to people about their work and what's happening in the field with the hopes of making this growing arena just a little bit more accessible to us all.
You can find Let's Hear It on any podcast subscription platform.
You can find us online at letshearitcast.com. You can find us on LinkedIn, and yes, even on Instagram.
And if you like the show, please rate us on Apple Podcasts so that more people can find us.
So let's get on to the show.
And you're back. Welcome in. We're glad you found us.
Well,
it's Kirk. It's Eric. It's Let's Hear It.
Welcome in out of the rain if you were at Burning Man.
Oh my gosh. Grab a seat, clean yourself off, scrape the mud off your shoes.
Scrape the mud off your soul, people.
Oh man.
It's there. Burning Man.
Thoughts.
Anyway.
Many thoughts to the catastrophe that became Burning Man. Have you ever gotten to Burning Man, by the way?
No. Wild horses. No.
Apparently. So let's jump into it because you've got a good one. And this is actually one of we're running a series now of people that don't have anything to sell you. And nobody here has tried to sell you anything. Nobody here has tried to convince you anything, but there are great stories and there's great strategy to reflect on. So tell us what's ahead, Eric. This is another good one. Let's hear it.
We're not going to sell, but we'll lease with an option to buy. And this episode, I speak with Dena Kimball, who is the executive director of the Kendeda Fund, which is one of the foundations that was started with the Home Depot fortune, who's the ex-wife of Arthur Blank, the Home Depot guy. And Dena Kimball is the executive director and the daughter of the founder of the Kendeda Fund. And we have an extra special guest joining us in this conversation, David Brotherton of Brotherton Strategies, but who has also been advising the Kendeda Fund for many years on grantmaking and communications. So the three of us joined together on location. So we're not on Zoom. We're actually in a room together like humans.
It's incredible.
Which was great fun to talk about the Kendeda Fund, which is spending up or spending out or spending down or spending over. It is going out of business. And actually, as we go to air in mid-September of 2023, the new website for the Kendeda Fund's What It Has Learned will, I hope, be live so that you can go over there and check out the many lessons that they are gathering. They will have a podcast as well, which should be really terrific. So they're doing a wonderful job of talking about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what they've learned.
And I'm glad you called that out. So, of course, the founder here is Diana Blank. Diana brings in Dena Kimball to help create this spend down strategy for over $1 billion, which is one of the reasons why we're not trying to sell anything, right? The Kendeda Foundation is just trying to tell you what this experience was, share their stories. I do want to talk about this podcast briefly before we get to the interview. It's stories from the Kendeda Fund. You can find it on the website. There's been great write-ups about it at the Chronicle of Philanthropy and by the Funders Network. But check it out. One of the reasons we started this podcast is we wanted to tell more stories about people in this field, and to see a foundation picking this up and saying, hey, let's memorialize what we learned. And big call out to David here, who I'm sure had something in the background to do with this podcast coming live. And you've got a good one if you can find somebody who can lead your comms plus lead your gun violence prevention strategy. And David has been doing both of those things terrifically for Kendeda for years. So this is a really great conversation. This is Dena Kimball and David Brotherton on Let's Hear It.
Welcome to Let's Hear It. My guests today are Dena Kimball, the executive director of the Kendeda Fund, and David Brotherton, fund advisor and or director of communications, possibly factotum. Would that be appropriate?
All of the above.
Maybe some other things. Thank you to the both of you for coming and talking to us.
We're happy to be here today.
Yeah, Eric, great to sit down with you. Thanks.
I know you get to sit down with David Brotherton in a professional setting, which is a strange and scary experience, but we'll do the best we can.
Welcome to my world, Eric.
Better you than me is all I can say, Dena.
Guys, I'm right here.
Who? I have no idea who he's. I heard a noise. Well, we're here today because Kendeda Fund is going out of business. Is the shorter version of it. Some people say spending down. Some people say sunsetting. We have all sorts of wonderful names for what happens. But this is one of the rare occasions of a foundation that decides to do its work within a specific period of time and then not. And so I just wanted to ask you, Dena, if you could just give us a little background on the Kendeda Fund, how it got started, what you set out to accomplish. And then we'll get into all the joys and excitements about what you're going through right now.
Amazing. I love it. Okay, the background on Kendeda. So the Kendeda Fund is really a 30-year giving journey. It was founded by my mother, Diana Blank. The source of her wealth came from the Home Depot. My father, Arthur Blank, was one of the founders of the Home Depot. And in her late 40s, early 50s, my mom found herself in a place she never thought she would be in, which is divorced and very wealthy. To be honest, neither of those things are things that she sought out for in her life. I don't think anyone's ever really happy to be divorced necessarily, although the wealth part too was really uncomfortable for her. And she really was forced to sort of grapple with this situation that she never expected to be in. And thus sort of began a long philanthropic journey that was really 3 phases. I think early on, you had a very tentative philanthropist. There was no Kendeda Fund. It was very anonymous, checkbook giving, really with the aid of a wealth advisor to sort of local organizations that she heard about. About 10 years in, she decided to put a light structure around her philanthropy. She created the Kendeda Fund. Everyone always wants to know where we got the name. It's my older brother, Kenneth, myself, Dena, and then my little sister, Danielle, Da. So Kendeda is named after her 3 children. That was a way for my mom to give a personal connection to the family, but also to maintain her anonymity, which was incredibly important for her. And so that sort of second 10 years of her giving was still very anonymous, a very light structure. She had 1 consultant. She gave more toward giving in Atlanta, giving in Montana, where she established a second home, and then a burgeoning interest in environmental work, which was very much a part of her background as a child, the kind of healing power of nature. A lot of time spent on Long Island with her grandmother, foraging for mushrooms and shucking oysters, and all of that connection to nature really came forth in that second phase of her philanthropy. And then in the third phase, the final 10 years or so, I joined in. She asked me to come help her out if I would, and I was honored and happy to do that. And we established a little more structure around the giving. She also decided that she was comfortable sort of shedding her anonymity at that point. And we have established sort of 7 more formal giving programs. We now have a bigger staff than we had at the time. We have about 6 full-time staff members, but are still relatively small. And this year, as you noted, is our final year of giving. We call it Spending Out, which has felt like the right phase for us. I mean, it's been a really remarkable journey. It'll be over about $1 billion in grant making that she'll have made in 30 years.
That's incredible. It's funny, I've foraged for subway tokens in Queens, so I really feel a kinship with your mom. So it's interesting. I've seen a number of foundations that went from anonymous to not anonymous. BAR is a good example, and there are a number of others. And I'm just curious about what does coming out of anonymity do for a foundation? Dave and I are communications folks, and we think, more communication the better. Not always, but in this instance, it feels like Kendeda had an opportunity to use its voice in a different way once it wasn't anonymous. Maybe David can kick that off.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned BAR because you may or may not remember, I was one of the consultants that they brought in when they were getting ready to go from anonymous to not. And I helped them think through what were the communications implications of that choice. And it turned out to work swimmingly for them. There were certainly some challenges and hiccups. Shifting grant focus, going kind of all in on climate and some other things caused some internal challenges for grantees, but they weathered it well, and I think are exponentially stronger because of it. Well, that experience was partly what attracted Kendeda to find me when they did. Shortly after Dena had come on, they were getting ready to make what was at that time, and maybe still is, the biggest single gift in the foundation's history, which was a $30 million grant to Georgia Tech to build the South's greenest building. But there was a bunch of stuff that was happening. In addition to that, Diana was more comfortable in her own skin. She was, I think, splitting her time between Montana and Atlanta. She was just feeling more empowered in her posture in the world. And I think recognized that, most importantly, that big gift and grants which would follow were going to not have the leverage and impact that they could if she was still hiding behind the curtain. Not to mention, it was sort of fast becoming the worst kept secret in Atlanta. A lot of people knew. It was just everyone was agreeing not to talk about who she was. All of that adds up to how we approached helping Kendeda step out into the light. The masterful sort of way with which Diana came out, tipped her hat, acknowledged the work she was doing and why it mattered, introduced Dena as the new leader of the fund, was done in such a way in a story in the Atlanta Business Chronicle that it opened the lid, but not in such a way that it put permanent pressure on Diana. She was then able to sort of step back into her old self, let Dena be empowered to run the foundation for the next decade. And it worked very well for us. And I think that's when the first website came around. That's when we established a social media presence, all the things you do as a communicator to help an organization use its voice most effectively, we started doing. But that was all new to Kendeda. So it took time to find our stride, find our voice, understand where we wanted to lean in or lean back. And we've continued to refine and tinker, of course, over the last 10 years. But I think we're in a place now where the choice was clearly the right one. We wouldn't be able to be sitting here with you today if we were still anonymous.
Well, you could, but we just couldn't say anything. It'd be a very quiet interview.
I have a funny story about that, which is when Diana first established a fund at the Tides Foundation, they had said it was an anonymous donor, and her wealth advisor had said, let's just call her for the purposes right now, Mrs. Blank. And being clever, that worked for a little while. I want to just touch on maybe just two things related to David's really great answer. One was we had done a grantee effectiveness survey with the Center for Effective Philanthropy a few years before I came on, and there was a lot of good tidbits in there, a lot of positive feedback. But one of the things we did see was that our grantees were saying, gosh, thank you for everything you do. And if you could do one additional thing, it would be to be out there a little bit more, leveraging your voice on our behalf. How that has played out, I mean, I think in the last 10 years, we established a portfolio in Atlanta on racial equity in 2015. And our fund advisor at the time, Tanae Traylor, her approach was to stand up a lot of very new and nascent organizations and BIPOC leaders, most of whom had not been invested in significantly by the more traditional Atlanta philanthropy. And one of her very explicit goals was to, over the course of 7-8 years, to get those organizations operationally strong enough and ready to receive those infusions, but also just reputationally be in a place where they were quote unquote de-risked for more traditional philanthropy elements. And we obviously couldn't have done that being anonymous and being so behind the scenes. So just, one specific example of where I think it's hopefully not just served us well, least important is that, but really that it served our grantees well by having done so.
Yeah. Well, you certainly can't be anonymous if you're spending out, because you have to tell people what your plans are. Can you tell us a little bit about that way of thinking? Was this something that you always knew you were going to do? Is it something that came along when you decided that there were opportunities that you didn't want to pass up and that was the strategy to get you there?
When Diana started, when my mom started, that was not, limited life was not part of her lexicon. She was definitely not focused on what the next 30 years would look like. I do think from the very beginning, she never thought of this money as her legacy and was very sensitive even from the beginning about involving her kids, wanting us to be able to go out and live our own life. So I think that the kernels of spend out were sort of always there, but that wasn't really formalized until maybe, 20 years in, 15 years in. She has a great deal of urgency. There's huge problems on the world, obviously. She's trying to tackle a number of them in her giving areas. And I think she felt also a great deal of urgency to do what she could in her lifetime, trusting and knowing that there would be others who would take up where she left off. And I think her relationship with the big L word, legacy, is just a very light one. And she felt like her legacy, quote unquote, would be best served by doing what she could in her lifetime.
Yeah. So, and our friend Glenn Galich has been on this, or as his wife says, Glenn Galich. Glenn and his wife disagree on the pronunciation of his own last name, which I find to be an entertaining little tidbit. Glenn has...
People say Blanc, blank,
So Glenn has said there is no good reason for a foundation to exist in perpetuity. Of course, I think he says that just because he likes to throw Molotov cocktails and things like that. But there's some kernel of interest in that point. So, David, notwithstanding Glenn's extremely full-throated endorsement for spending out limited life, call it what you will, there must be some good reasons for perpetuity. I'm sure you've thought about this a lot. What do you think?
Well, of course there are. I mean, it is the default. The switch is to default on virtually every foundation that exists towards perpetuity. And I mean, as a guy who's been consulting in philanthropy for 20 plus years, I've worked for lots of those organizations. You've worked for some of them.
Maybe a few.
That said, I don't know that I can explain or justify that decision for other organizations, but I'll try anyway. The existential nature of many of the problems that we're facing, that argument can be used either way, right? Climate change isn't going away in the next 20 years. It's only going to get worse. We need to stay in the fight for the long haul, hence perpetuity. Or climate change is so bad, we got to throw everything we can at it right now, as fast as we can, limited life. I think so much of it depends on the vision, intent, and frame or theory of change, to speak philanthropies, of the founder or the early board or the original donor, and the need to honor their intentions over time, that it is just a uniquely personal organizational decision ultimately. I think in our case, Diana, I don't want to speak too much for your family, Dena, but I think a part of her motivation was she didn't want to be presumptuous in saddling her children or her grandchildren with something they needed to maintain. It's sort of like everybody knows you shouldn't give someone a puppy without their permission. It's a little presumptuous.
$billion puppy
to say, now here it is, go raise it. Kidding aside, it is a sort of big version of that same question. It's like, who am I to assume they want to do this? And I think in Diana's case, it was all of the above. Issues are hot. We need to work on them now. She didn't want to stay around or leave this problem with her children and grandchildren. And she wanted to see the impacts of the work while she was still around to recognize them and appreciate them. Have we solved all those big problems? Of course not. But, she can feel good at age 80 that she has done a hell of a lot to advance the issues that matter to her.
So this foundation feels like, as you both described, an intensely personal institution that really reflects the ethos of the founder, which has been passed down to you, Dena, and to the staff. A very small staff, I might add, and the organization has been run in a very personal way. Not so much so. I mean, small staff, your evaluations component, you actually, I don't know, what do? You work with your own grantees to conduct evaluations. You know, grant cycle. I mean, it sounds like it could be really fabulous, or it could be a total disaster. Dena, can you just walk us through how you've experienced running such a close institution that is really based on these values and which didn't end up being a 40-person staff with a lot of trappings and a lot of institutional layers?
It's a really great question, and I feel like you kind of nailed a lot of sort of our special sauce in that question, so bravo to you.
Every so often, a blind squirrel gets a nut.
Congratulations.
Sorry, got my nut.
Sarah Silverman says in one of her stand-ups that squirrels lose 95% of the nuts they bury. But they put enough of them out there.
Good to know.
Eventually they'll find one.
There you go.
Well, maybe that's an approach to our grantmaking too. No, I hope not. I really hope not. Okay, so I would say this. Two things. One is one of Diana's mantras. She has two. Or she has many, but the two that really guide her. One of them is Joseph Campbell's Follow Your Bliss, which really basically speaks to this idea of not just following like your interest because it's fun or it'll make you happy, but sort of a deep belief that if you really are listening to the things that activate and animate you, your passions, that becomes a opportunity to go really deep, to leverage that passion for deep curiosity, for lifelong learning, for lots of rigor, for lots of engagement, for deep relationships. And that is the expectation she's had of herself. And that is the invitation that she has given to her team to bring, I don't want it to sound like we're this sort of fluffy crew that just goes around and kind of funds what we like. But I think this notion of following your bliss at the organizational level, certainly at the founder level, and frankly at the staff level, is done because I think my mom intuitively understands that following bliss is a way to bring rigor, deep relationships, lifelong learning, which I think are the hallmarks for lots of good grant making, not just grant making we do, but grant making others do. So that's maybe the first thing I'll say. The second is it does, I think, require a lot of trust in the communities and movements that we're a part of, certainly in the small staff that she has hired. We have absolutely made mistakes. You don't give away, $50, $60, $70 million a year and not make mistakes. But I think in sometimes that those mistakes, if I reflect on the biggest mistakes that I feel like I've made, it has been more an outgrowth of not being in authentic enough relationships with my grantees and having more of a top-down agenda. Her second mantra is, I wonder what this will be like. And I think that speaks to this ongoing learning, ongoing curiosity. And I think we have generally been attracted to grantees who are sort of obsessed with their own learning. They're going to be doing the learning whether or not we're around and funding them. We are just partners in that and along for the ride. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. You touched on this idea of trust, which I think it is the most important value that a foundation and their grantees can have in common.
Yeah.
If you trust each other, then people are allowed to say what went wrong, and you're allowed to say what you don't know. And those two conversations don't always happen in philanthropy, and it feels to me like you were able to build trust with them in ways that allowed you to really understand whether you were going in the right direction, or if not, how you could adjust to help everybody.
Yeah. I mean, we have a segment of our work that is in partnership with the Blackfeet tribe in Montana. It would be almost impossible for us to go into relationship with that community and think we have a better sense of exactly where the money should go and, how one might reintroduce buffalo in the most sensitive, impactful way to the Badger 2 medicine wilderness. Like that is not our domain. That is not our dish that we cook. And yet it has been so fun and engaging and inspiring to learn through them and with them. And I do think that trust has been mutually extended. And there have been, I think, throughout the spend out process, our grantees also trusting in us that we're going to uphold our end of the bargain and our relationship with them, do the very best we can to support them. We have a operating reserves program that we've created for our grantees to build up their operating reserves in advance of our leaving. And, we sort of feel like that is sort of a mutual compact and a mutual trust that we are going to be there with them through 2023 and do everything we can to position them for success on the back end.
Well, that's a great spot to take a quick break. When we come back from the break, I want to talk a lot more about the spending out experience, the things that you're doing right now and what you're thinking about what you want to leave. So we'll be right back with Dena Kimball and David Brotherton. You're listening to Let's Hear It, a podcast about foundation and nonprofit communications, hosted by Eric Brown and Kirk Brown. Let's Hear It is sponsored by the Stupski Foundation, a foundation returning all its resources to the communities it calls home in Hawaii and the San Francisco Bay Area by 2029 to support just and resilient food, health, and higher education systems for all. Because change can't wait. Learn more at stupski.org. And now, back to the show. And we are back with Dena Kimball, the executive director of the Kendeda Fund, and David Brotherton, fund advisor and factotum. I like totem.
New title. I love this.
It's a very good title.
Is that a capital F?
Depends.
It is a very ribald Charles Bukowski book, which was
possible.
Gifted to me at some point by somebody, but I'm a little uncomfortable with.
I'm not sure what it means, but it sounded right. I think we all have a sense of what this organization is and what it is hoped to achieve and the way it has done that. Now, as you are in the last months of your existence, you have put together kind of a plan to talk about your work, to engage with your grantees, and to help other people learn from what you've learned. Maybe I'll start with you, David. How did you think about telling that story? What
Sure.
went through your mind?
Number one, we aren't the first foundation to do this, right? So there's a breadcrumb trail of great learning and experience and trial and error that predates us. There's the big famous tentpole versions, Rosenwald, Atlantic Philanthropies. There's lots of smaller foundations, some of which are well known, some of which are not. So we started by doing our homework and just trying to learn who did what, how to go, what worked and what failed. To that end, we brought in the woman, Anita Nager, who was the last program director at Belden and sort of helped ride them into the sunset. She had a wealth of experience and opinions and ideas on how we should go about it. And we've been engaged with her for 4 or 5 years at this point. And she forced some very early questions, obvious things like pick a date. You can't do this if you aren't specific, both for programmatic purposes and for investment purposes. We needed to know what was the pool of funds we had to work with and what were we trying to run down. Grantees deserve to know all of that stuff. We also recognized you need to be communicative and transparent about this choice as early as possible. Grantees deserve it. The work shifts and moves based on the trajectory of funding. In my gun violence prevention portfolio, it was a tail. It was a ramp down with most of my grantees. You don't want to just drop them off a cliff. Oh, by the way, that was your last grant. Good luck. We were very explicit and worked with them to sort of ease the blow of us going away. We also helped establish operating reserves at 30 or more of our kind of core partners, organizations who maybe didn't anticipate the value of having a rainy day fund that they could draw from, when the next COVID comes down or whatever crisis might present itself. We worked very intentionally with those groups to help them build up those operating reserves for long-term organizational health. On the communication side, I guess this is a communications podcast at some level. There was a bunch of things we started doing maybe more recently in the last couple of years. Planning for a website where a bunch of things could live. The website will not be structured in a traditional way, the way foundation sites commonly are. Here's our programs, here's our team. It's going to be more of a narrative experience for interested parties who might want to learn from our example. That could be other funders, that could be emergent donors who haven't even established their own philanthropic sort of plan yet. It will be our grantee partners as a way to lift up and highlight some of the great work they did. That site's going to have a 9-episode podcast competing with Let's Hear It, of course.
Clearly. We're going to squish them like a buck. No.
It will have...
Congratulations.
Thank you. It will have a really compelling data visualization journey that visitors can go on that kind of shows visually what does 30 years of grant making look like. It will have reflections from each of our programs on what does the work mean, how has it gone well, what are the challenges ahead for the next 10 or 20 or 30 years. So we're kind of trying to create this place where big ideas can live that are less about wasn't Kendeda great or isn't Diana an amazing person for having done it, but more about what the heck did we learn along the way. And if a half a dozen or 50 organizations can learn from that, then it was worth it. But it is an interesting last year. It feels increasingly breathless. Like what was December 31st, 2023 felt like forever from now, just a couple of years ago. Now I can hear that drumbeat every morning when I wake up thinking, oh my gosh, 7 months, 6 months, 5 months. It's kind of a fun ride.
Well, Dena, this notion that we want to try and influence other funders, it feels like every foundation wants to influence other funders. They want other people to fund the things they're funding, and sometimes they're even willing to fund the things that other people are funding. so that you can get more leverage or whatever you want to use as your descriptor. But the idea that now there's a lot more funder, we believe that there's more money coming, maybe. So Oxfam said that during the first 2 years of the pandemic, there was a new billionaire created every 33 hours. That's a billionaire with a B. So that's 573 billionaires. And our hope is that they will decide to give that money away to good causes. And my guess is that for a foundation that has done what it's done, learned what it's learned, that those are some of the types of people that you could have a lot of leverage with. Do you have one piece of advice for those 572 billionaires with a B who, with any luck at all, will do something good with that money?
If I had one piece of advice, I heard this quote. My mom religiously watches CBS Sunday morning, and therefore part of my job description is also to watch CBS Sunday morning every Sunday. Recently, Michael J. Fox was on, and he said something at the end, related to his personal lifetime with Parkinson's now, but he said something to the effect of gratitude becomes the basis for sustaining optimism. And I think my piece of advice would be, if you can maintain a posture of gratitude throughout this, the gratitude for the opportunity to make a difference, the gratitude that on a daily basis you have the chance to be around incredible change makers who are doing amazing work in the world, even in the face of a lot of evidence to the contrary. I think it becomes much easier to stay in a place of optimism as opposed to a place of hopelessness and despair. And I think that optimism becomes a point at which we can connect with people whose life experiences are very, very different from ours. It's sort of in a shared collective journey to make the world a better place. So I think my one piece of advice would be to try to just stay in a posture of gratitude. Oh, also to pay a communications advisor a lot of money. That would be my second piece of advice. David wanted me to make sure I got that in.
We should work on that.
Do you want to reset your rate?
No, I would just add to Dena's sarcasm. The real truth of our journey and the communicating we are doing this year is not to go to the world with a posture that spending out is what you must do. This is a story about spending out is what Kendeda chose to do. And we learned some stuff along the way. We've made some choices structurally, operationally, programmatically along the way. And most of those resulted in good outcomes. Sometimes there were some bumpy lessons learned along the way. But this is a journey that one woman with one worldview has gone through, and we are here to help her actualize that. That's different from Glenn Galich, who has a very strong point of view that everybody should do it, and there's no justification for retained wealth. We entertain all comers, and I think we just want to position Kendeda as one perspective, one potential path, one set of lessons that if others want to read the playbook or pay attention, great. We're going to serve up some stuff that you can learn from.
Yeah, one of the reasons that foundations, I think, don't like to say what went wrong is I've long said that, and I use the royal we because I used to work for one. We have phenomenally paper-thin skins and we're hemophiliacs. We just don't want anyone to say anything bad about
on blood thinners.
On blood thinners. That's right. And when a foundation is candid about what didn't go according to plan, it's how you build trust with grantees. It's how you maybe perhaps build trust with your colleagues in the field, but it's also how you learn and how you teach. Dena, can you talk about, you are clearly a foundation that is willing to say what it thinks, but in ways that are, I think, quite generous to all concerned. Can you talk about some of the things that you learned, maybe something you would have done a little differently?
Thank you for saying that. That's kind.
The added benefit of truth.
Yeah, well, I hope so. On our best days, I hope so. I've been thinking a little bit about regret and I think there is one thing other than David that I regret. It's just, we're next to it.
The apotheosis of brotherhood.
To do it all over again, she would not have brought me on.
I would say the thing I regret is I think I was very focused on maintaining one of Diana's sort of values on not, centering ourselves, not having a light touch with our philanthropy, not building up this big institution, and so on and so forth. And so I myself really stayed away from, I think I embodied very much her value of quiet giving, lead by example, humility, blah, blah, blah. I hope so. But what I think I missed a little bit on was her equal and sometimes opposite value on curiosity. And it kept me away from some of the colleagues and people that I've had the chance to meet in the last 6 months who really are just as thoughtful, if not more than we are, and really are doing great work in philanthropy. And I think in some ways, the attempt to maybe differentiate ourselves put me at arm's distance from some colleagues who I could have learned a lot from. Just one example is, I had a chance recently to be in conversation with a few other second generation types, which is not the normal company I keep, that the National Center for Family Philanthropy had put me in a room with. And it was really like a lovely, thought-provoking, thoughtful hour. And I regret not putting myself in some of those spaces a little more often.
And so now I'd like to go out with my favorite question. And I'll start with you, David. What's one thing that you're most proud of?
Oh, convincing Dena to hire me. No.
No, it's not hard.
There is a lot to be proud of in this organization's work over 30 years. Me personally, as a guy who wears two hats, one is communications, one is programs focused on gun violence prevention. We, in our gun violence work, made an intentional and early choice to focus on how the frame around gun violence can shape attitudes around the issue. It is, like so many things in our world these days, a polarized pro versus anti, red versus blue, pick your frame. But it is one of those deeply polarizing issues. We made a choice in this portfolio, as well as in most of our others, that investments in storytelling can soften the acrimony. And so we've done that in a bunch of ways. We went big and often to support The Trace, which is the only full-time dedicated newsroom covering guns and gun violence and the business of guns all the time. It's a single subject newsroom that has won tons of awards and done amazing reporting. We have invested in Sundance documentary films around guns and gun violence, trying to expand the public health frame that defines the issue, trying to look at guns not just as an urban crime issue, but as a suicide issue, as a rural state issue, presenting the complexity of this issue. We've funded podcasts focused on comparing and contrasting the Mountain West's attitudes on guns with the Deep South's attitudes on guns, et cetera, et cetera. And our grantees have won awards along the way, including the first ever Pulitzer Prize for NPR with a podcast that spun out of a project we did there. Long story short, it is something I am immensely proud of because other funders in gun violence now recognize, oh, there's more to solving this problem than just funding research or community violence intervention. Like, there is a frame in which the world sees and makes sense of or understands this issue. And I think we have done, it is still a massive and intractable problem, let's be clear. We have not solved gun violence in America, but we have made the conversation different. And I think others, when we're gone, when Kendeda is no more, I know for a fact other foundations in that issue are going to carry those forward. And I'm very, very proud of that.
It's great work. You should be proud of it. And now, since you're going to need a job, I have a new tagline for you. David Brotherton, softening the acrimony. I think that's going to get you some work. Dena, let's leave you with the last word. What are you most proud of?
Wow, I get the last word.
Besides hiring me.
Yeah. What I am most proud of, there is so much, and certainly the results of our grant making, I'm incredibly proud of. Our living building, the hundreds of new worker owners, the parent-driven education reform in Atlanta, and so on and so forth. I think And I'm certainly not going to just pick one. But I would say in some ways how we work. So you viewers can't see, but I'm wearing a very cute t-shirt that was given to us by one of our grantees, the Atlanta Village Market, that's focused on Black enterprise. And the t-shirt says, "Support is a verb." We have written a lot of checks. We have given a lot of tangible dollar support. But I very much think the posture of the team, the Kendeda Fund, and hopefully our grantees also for one another has been very much support is a verb, that it is a daily act, not a check you write. And that's what I'm most proud of, is living up to that as best we could.
Well, it's great work. Congratulations. It's such a pleasure to talk with you about it. I always learn so much from people like you. And I appreciate you coming on. Dena Kimball, the executive director of the Kendeda Fund, David Brotherton, communications
advisor.
And thanks again for
Eric,
coming
thanks for having us. It was really a hoot.
Thank you, Eric. Just a pleasure.
Thank you.
And we're back. First of all, we have to talk about Diana Blank for just a moment.
Yeah.
And Dena Kimball. And one of the things you didn't mention in your setup, but Kendeda's based in Atlanta.
Right.
They're based in the South. And we're here in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we're so used to these massive philanthropies kind of getting organized in the Bay Area and coming forward with all their audacious strategies. I think the fact that Diana chose to locate the geography for the work in the South, coming out of Atlanta, I just think that's a part of this story that really bears reflection. And then, of course, the other piece of it is engaging Dena to say, hey, let's learn how we do this together, but we're actually going to do this. We're going to spend this thing out. And I feel like they did that relatively early in their trajectory. As we have seen more spend out stuff recently, but I feel like they've quietly been at this for a while. But what do you make of all of that? That combination of family, it's learning to do this together. It's a massive amount of money, $1 billion. And this is coming from Atlanta, Georgia, not San Francisco or Seattle or, any of our West Coast cities.
The elites of the West Coast.
Though, of course, Atlanta is elite by far in its own right, right?
Sure. Well, I think just in general that this foundation is of a type, it is a family-run organization. They never aspired to be huge in staffing. They never aspired to be the story. Kendeda was very quiet. It was anonymous for a fair amount of time, and then it was kind of semi-anonymous. And slowly, I love the story about Mrs. Blank, who was the philanthropist, and they were just kind of calling it Blank instead of who it was, and it actually her name was Blank. Funny story about anonymity. I guess when your name is Blank and you want to be anonymous, that's one way to do it. But the point is that this foundation has run itself in a very personal, quiet, local way. And for a community like Atlanta, which doesn't see a ton of large philanthropy, I'm sure that it has made an enormous amount of difference for people, because they really were able to have those kinds of conversations and to be that kind of personal institution for people. And I think that's quite interesting. The other thing is just how they did their work and how they decided to go out of business all feels very authentic. It doesn't feel like a big performance art piece. This is about how you are going to take your family and your personal values and apply them to your philanthropy. And I really just can't commend them enough for the way they have gone about this. I think it's just a great lesson for folks out there. Stupski Foundation, we now a sponsor, but a long time ago we had Glenn Gallich on as guest, also a foundation that is spending out and doing it in, I think, a very, very thoughtful way. Those are great examples of foundations that have been very specific, very direct. They were able to concentrate their funding because they had a shorter time horizon and make a real difference.
But as we talk about this, I like the intersection between the personal stories as well as the philanthropic journey here. And of course, Dena is the executive director of the Kendeda Fund, also a fund advisor for Girls' Rights. The gravity of this decision, the gravity of the decision to become first more public with your grant making and then to say, we're going to spend this down and try to do this thoughtfully, I think is something that we don't get that many opportunities to hear firsthand from the folks that are most connected to this work, that they take it very seriously. And this is difficult work to do and do well, and to feel like you're hitting that mark internally, that internal compass that we all bring with us, that you're saying to yourself, actually, I'm doing this and doing this well. And I have to say, the opportunity to enlist the services of somebody like David Brotherton, you can see the camaraderie, the congeniality, two strong colleagues, but also doing very thoughtful work. And I loved when you asked David kind of what he was most proud of in the grant making they'd done. He reflected on things like narrative change, doing some innovative things with that. But to me, that's one of the things that sort of comes out here, that there's a personal journey that people go through as they go through a process like that. And that journey is very serious. People take it very seriously. It takes a lot of work, a lot of rigor to do it and do it well. And there's actually some work required there to keep the balance right, because you're doing something that's so extraordinarily important in such an important part of the country as well.
Yeah. Well, again, if you're a foundation or a family foundation or a philanthropist in one way or the other, I mean, here's a little plug for David Brotherton. Having somebody whom you trust, who understands the field and who can provide you with candor about how to go about your work is great. And now, as it happens, David Brotherton's going to need a job because Kendeda's going out of business. Everyone should just hire him to do that kind of work. But the way they went about it was grounded in their values, that it was never about them. It was really about, are we making a difference? How are we engaging with people? Are we listening carefully? Are we paying attention to what the needs are out there? And those are the values that have guided that institution from the get-go, from the very, very beginning. The thing that was hard for them, I think, was to come out and not be anonymous, because that value of being, I'd say, small c conservative or low-key trumped for a couple of years. But the fact is that communications is so important, and talking about what your goals are and learning from what you're doing publicly, that matters too. So you kind of have to balance that communications, that unanonymousness, with the nature of not being the story to hit that right feel in the right moment. And I think they did that.
When Diana brought and then Dena carried it forward, it looks like this notion of trust-based philanthropy to the work, that we're going to trust and rely on our partners to actually help us get in the right direction. And Dena talked about that this work requires a lot of trust, as well as I love this comment, how we work. Support is a verb for us. Support is about the actions that we take, and the posture of their fund is to really work from a place where support is a verb. But so what do you make of this concept of trust-based philanthropy? Because we've been hearing a lot more about it in philanthropy recently. It's, I think, a terrific contribution to the overall consideration of everything that's going on with this work and its scale. But it really feels like Kendeda has taken that really to heart, that this has been about trust-based philanthropy really from the get-go.
Sure. Well, trust-based philanthropy is both an organization now, so it's an organization that is dedicated to helping people understand a new way of doing philanthropy, which is identify leaders, give them the money, let them spend it in the way that they think matters most because they're the ones who are closest to the work. I think the word trust, I think it's relationship-based philanthropy. So maybe that's, it almost, I don't know, it downplays the value of the partnerships or the relationships that you have with people, because you get to know them, you understand what they're trying to achieve, and then you give them the resources that they need in order to do it. I think it's less about trust than it is about these relationships. But I also think it's incredibly important. And we have seen so-called strategic philanthropy, in which the foundation decides what the goal is. Essentially, they subcontract out their own strategies to organizations, and those organizations pursue those strategies to the letter sometimes, or if they don't, at their peril, and you're just kind of contracting that out. I mean, that's the extreme version of strategic philanthropy. And the foundation that I used to work for, the Hewlett Foundation, was well known for it. And the trick was to be strategic without being obnoxious. I think Hewlett squared that circle by giving general support grants to organizations to pursue specific strategies, but that they would, in certain instances, make changes as they saw, course corrections as they saw. So I think that's the kind of the balance of that. But the idea of finding organizations that are in alignment with what you're trying to achieve and giving them the funds they need to pursue the strategies that they think will work, I think is a great development. And there's no perfect way to do philanthropy, but I think that can be a really, really effective one. And it allows for a lot more creativity and a lot more flexibility, because we don't, as funders, they don't have all the answers. They sometimes don't even know what the problems are. They just know kind of in general what they're interested in. And this is where those kinds of really deep partnerships or deep relationships matter, and how you can get a lot done by applying them.
Well, if you just think about the sources of communication and the sources of information we all have access to, and you think about the multiplier effect of really relying on your grantees to be those information conduits for you. So you're not having to make all the decisions with just a handful of people around a conference table, but you've got people all over the place in the field seeing how things are playing out. That can lend a lot of nimbleness to strategies, I think, over time. So two things about Kendeda in terms of their start and then as they closed that I thought were so interesting. So as they got started, they used their dollars to de-risk organizations by putting the first philanthropic dollars in, helping say to other funders, this is a place where your dollars can go and they can be used safely and effectively here. I love that concept. It's such a cool idea that we use philanthropic dollars to de-risk certain kinds of grant making strategies. And then as they were running their closeout, coming to grantees saying, okay, we're going to have a ramp down process. We're going to be way in front of this. And as one of the results of our bend down, we're going to actually help you establish operating reserves. And I feel like this could be the next arc of really deep strategy in the grant making arena. So this notion of general operating support, that's always been so welcome. Don't handcuff me. Let me push these dollars where they need to go as a grantee, and let me make choices as we move along. But yet every organization runs this pressure of how do I fund this year? How do I make this all work out? And this is one of the big disconnects between foundations and their grantees. Foundations don't face that pressure. And so there's this inherent power imbalance between these people desperate to make their budget per year and these people that are kind of just trying to figure out how to get to their spend down year by year. But this idea of helping grantees develop operating reserves to help eliminate some of that stress, but also underscore that trust, saying, actually, we think over time and perpetuity, these are resources best sitting with you rather than sitting inside of the confines of a foundation endowment. That is a really interesting and I think actually important transition as grant making moves forward. I mean, what do you think about that? Helping organizations, not just with their year-over-year general operating funds, but actually helping them create reserves so they have something that they can lean into or fall back into as they need it.
This stuff is always tricky. If you're a nonprofit organization, someone gives you money for your reserves. The question is how long should I keep them in reserve when I shouldn't be spending them? What is my reserve spending plan or budget? How do I convince other funders that I still need money when I now have this bunch of money sitting in reserve? All that stuff is quite tricky. And I think it's a great idea. I think another really great idea is pay overhead. If you're a funder, pay a good amount of overhead. So that you're not causing these organizations to twist themselves into pretzels to meet your project goals. Make sure that you fund the workings of the organization, or even better yet, of course, general support. But nonprofits are always seeking money, and they're always trying to balance the fact that there may be this perception if a big funder comes in and gives them some spending that they can use over time, that they're overly funded, and so therefore someone else is doing the work. So it's always this dance. And endowments are even almost worse, because if you're going to live on your endowment, it means that 95% of your money has to sit in a bank or wherever, throwing off 5% of interest. And so if you have a $10 million endowment, you get to spend whatever it is, $50,000 a year.
Mm-hmm,
no, wait,
right,
no, $1 million endowment throws off $50,000 a year. So a $10 million endowment throws off $500,000, and you got $9,500,000 sitting there, whatever, molding. So endowments are kind of weird, and I don't like them because it really does lock up too much money. But this idea that we're going to give you enough money so for the next 3 years, you can fall back on something if your other spending goals don't pan out. And the other thing that I've said many, many, many times on this show is that the funding match, I believe, is still the greatest gimmick in philanthropy, and it works. And so, look, we'll put this much in if you put that much in, is one way to mitigate against this sense that this place is already funded by somebody else and I don't need to do anything. If it comes with those types of strings that are achievable but meaningful, I think you can also help an organization.
But then this brings us to the big question. So as we close, we have to come back to the big question.
The big question. What's the big question?
You're describing this challenge for organizations. If you've got an endowment, if you've got an operating reserve, how do you make these decisions? Are we using those dollars? Are they being wasted if they're sitting in a bank account? Well, isn't every foundation at scale wrestling with the same set of choices and decisions? So do I have $4 billion parked away that's creating X percent that I give out per year? Or do I actually take that money, push it into the field, and instead of me and my board of directors and trustees deciding, a dozen or 20 of us deciding what to do with $4 billion, let's empower several thousand people to decide what to do with $4 billion, because that's how many different organizations we would actually touch if we just push that into operating reserves in the field. So how do you square that circle? If the foundation came to you and said, we've got $1 billion and we're either going to spend it out in 10 years or we're going to operate in perpetuity, what would you say, Eric Brown? The $1 billion question. Let's hear it.
Question. All right, here's what I would say. I'm going to hedge slightly. It would depend on the area that I'm working in. And because there are some things that have kind of perpetual challenges. So it's possible that I would establish, or I would help support organizations that are doing this work over time and give them enough money and enough lead time to do it for a period of time. Or you could keep it in the foundation and make sure that these organizations are well funded and can rely on your spending over a long period of time, knowing that I can't think of the issue exactly, but I think hunger, homelessness, many of these kind of social challenges they will persist in one form or another over time. And you need to make sure that if you care about it, that it is taken care of. I actually frankly think that the arts is another one where foundation funding for arts is not good right now. And so if you dedicated your foundation to arts funding and made sure that certain types of organizations will be funded over time, I think that you could argue for a semi-perpetual organization. But there may be things that, if not now, never, like climate change. If we don't solve this problem now, then who cares what the future looks like? And you might say, okay, here are areas that if we could learn something really powerful about how to address climate change, that now's the time. You could defend your decision to spend it out in 10 years, because after 10 years, we're kind of over the cliff. So in a sense, it depends on the issue, but I think there are a lot of issues for which a very concentrated amount of funding would go a long way. Now, having said that, there is this other very good model that the Ed McConnell Clark Foundation set up when they created Blue Meridian Partners. So what they did was they moved all of their chips over into a new entity that was essentially a matching institution. And they brought in their $1 billion, brought in $6 or $7 or $8 billion in other funding from other funders to work on youth success, on giving youth opportunities that they don't have. And I think that's another really, really interesting model that we all could learn more about. So those are my three kind of fuzzy ideas about what I would do with my $1 billion.
Well, I want to thank you, and I'm happy to see what you do with your $1 billion.
You're very welcome.
I want to make the case.
Stand by. It's coming.
I want to make the case that it's not fuzzy at all, in the sense that we know that ecosystems require diversity to be resilient. And so having different foundations and different philanthropies, trying different strategies, different approaches, some spending down, some not. I think it's the combination of all of that thinking and the collection of what we learn from that helps us. And actually getting into the nitty gritty of how all these grants work, the pitch I would make to everybody is it's less about spend down or not. It's even less about general operating support or not. In my experience, you also want to think about timeframes. So if you push $1 million into an organization that's never consumed that much support before, and then you'd say, tell us how it goes in 12 months, you're almost setting that organization up for failure. So this notion of multi-year grants, I actually think it's multi-year, not saying it's 2-year increments. That's multi-years. It's like, no, actually, we're going to give you a large amount of money. We're going to call it general operating support. Come back to us in 2 years and tell us how you've scaled up to work at this level. And then we'll come back and do another couple of years, but now we'll fund at that level or even greater, because now we want to fund you to match the next increment of scale. And that kind of like scaling strategies, that notion that things need to sort of take time to heat up and get more effective. Our time is so limited, it seems like, in philanthropy, that sometimes we don't have the chance for those deeper conversations. But this concept of like just taking lessons learned and learning what worked, what didn't, to build off each other's experience. This is why I love stories from the Kendeda Fund. So again, Dena and David, thank you so much for creating this resource, this series of episodes that describe different aspects of your experience at the Kendeda Fund. I'm sure it was much harder to do than they initially envisioned to create this, series of podcasts, but there's some really interesting stuff in here, isn't there, Eric? I mean, they start out talking about the family dimension, Dena and Diana working together, pull examples from different interventions they've done. Their second episode is about Grove Park. They talk about regenerative design with Atlanta's green buildings, narrative change, community wealth building. I mean, all of the different things that they've worked on as a foundation. So what do you think, Eric? Should we encourage every foundation everywhere to create a podcast series that actually encapsulates parts of their strategy? Man, I think that would be amazing.
Absolutely. And you know what? If it puts us out of business, Kirk, that's okay. That's okay. Because it'll be all for the good. By the way, can I just say something, Kirk? I think you're getting really good at this.
What are you talking about?
You really can't. You managed this conversation so nicely. I appreciate that a lot.
I hang out in the background. I do nothing. You do all the work. You find all the people. You have all the conversations. And every now and then I show up for 15 minutes. That's what goes on around here. Let's be clear. We know what happens.
You're just getting to be quite the whiz. And I'm not being facetious. I mean that.
Well, so in terms of putting ourselves out of business, let's wrap this up here then. Dena Kimball, David Brotherton, very soon your work will be done with the Kendeda Fund. I think it's just the starting point, though, for what's ahead for both of you, the lessons you've accumulated, the stories, the experience. Again, David being able to balance both the comm side and the program side, that is a very tough thing to do. My colleague Eric Brown can probably attest to that in many ways. And then Dena, taking this so seriously, doing this so well, working within the context of a family legacy, working with Dena Blank to take this foundation and carry it forward. This is a tremendous testament to the work, gravity, the seriousness, the intelligence, the thoughtfulness, and just the real graciousness that's been on display here. So as we close, Dena reminds us that gratitude is really important, that we shouldn't forget the gratitude that should underscore all of this. So it's Eric with great gratitude. I say thank you for your compliment, but also thank you for this great conversation. This has been a great one today.
And speaking of gratitude, another vote of gratitude, a vote of thanks to the College Futures Foundation, our newest sponsor. We are deeply grateful to you.
Thank you so much for sponsoring this podcast. Thanks all of you who are listening. And thank you to all of our guests. My goodness, this field is full of awesome people, isn't it, Eric?
It certainly is. And you is full of you, Kirk.
There you go. Dena Kimball, David Brotherton, the Kendeda Fund. That was awesome. We'll see you next time on Let's Hear It. Okay, everybody, that's it for this episode. Please let us know if you have any thoughts about what you heard today or people we should have on this show, and that definitely includes yourself. And we'd like to thank
our indefatigable producer, Harper Brown,
John Ali, the tuneful and inspiring composer of our theme music,
our sponsor, the Lumina Foundation.
And please check out Lumina's terrific podcast, Today's Students, Tomorrow's Talent, and you can find that at luminafoundation.org.
We certainly thank today's guest and, of course, all of you.
And most importantly, thank you, Mr. Brown.
Oh, no. Thank you, Mr. Brown.
Okay, everybody. Until next time.